It's a big pleasure to introduce Karim Jerbi. Karim is a French scientist now working in Montreal, in Canada. I like to say he speaks Italian, as he's spent, I think, 6 months in Sardinia, a very nice place. Sorry if I provide this kind of biased information.
No, it was an awesome time. I loved Sardinia. I was in Cagliari for for an internship many years ago. Yeah, that's amazing.
Beautiful place. Now Karim is Canada research chair in computational neuroscience and cognitive neuroimaging. He's the director of a unique neuro AI research center and head of the COCO lab, which is cognitive and computational neuroscience lab. So his work and the work of his group is very much at the boundary, I would say, between neuroscience and mathematics, basically, so computational mathematics. So, and Karim will provide an overview on brain-computer interfaces with a very nice title. Thank you very much for being here, Karim, and please go.
Thanks, Alberto. I'm just checking to see if I can share my screen. I am not sure that I have that permission right now.
You should.
Yeah, okay. Good. So this should be, let's see. Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. So the title of my presentation today is Brain-Machine Interfaces: Uploading Your Consciousness to a Robot and Other Beautiful Myths. And this actually resulted from a discussion that I had with Alberto about what would be useful for this meeting. I would like, of course, to first start by thanking the organizing committee. Gian Vittorio Luria, Annalisa Pascarella, Michele Piana, Sara Somariva, Alberto Sorrentino, and Alessandro Viani for having me. And I would also want to make a disclaimer in terms of the topic of my talk. So it's about BCI, but I also had a suggestion to talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on. But in the discussion with Alberto, he suggested it might make more sense, given the context, to focus on brain-computer interfaces per se, which I am happy to do, although we're doing less BCI right now and more AI and machine learning. So anyway, for anybody who's not happy with the content, you complain to Alberto, not to me, okay? Okay, so first of all, one of the first things that comes up to mind when we talk about brain-computer interfaces is the notion of mind reading. And people wonder, and in particular journalists, whether we will be able to decode people's thoughts. So this is like the question that always comes up. To answer that question, one needs to think about how one would go on theoretically to be able to do that. And of course, that's not an easy thing to do, because simply if you want to be able to decode, first of all, you need to understand how things are encoded in a system, right? So this is what I like to often refer to as the yin and yang of brain-machine interfaces. Decoding, if that's what you want to do, goes with encoding. You need to be able to encode information and understand how the encoding occurs, so that when that type of pattern emerges, that you're able to recognize it in the context of brain-computer interfaces. Okay, so again, the idea of this talk is more of like an introduction to brain-machine interfaces 101 type presentation, where I will go through some of the basics and give you some information about how what BCIs or BMIs are and what they're useful for and what's the current trend. So let's start first off with a definition. Okay, what is a brain-machine interface? Globally, we could refer to this as a system that will allow direct communication between the brain and an external device. That could be a computer, it could be a prosthesis, a robot, or anything else. It could be your phone, for instance. And obviously, this interaction is not direct, right? You'll have to go through something to make that interaction possible. That interface is what will that connection is going to be an integral part of what we call globally the brain-machine interface setup. So the information is typically collected from the brain. One way to do that, it's not the only way, but one way to do that is using EEG signal acquisition. And then the signal is processed and you go through translation or decoding to achieve some output or a communication with the device. So now this makes it sound easy: record brain activity and then just decode it and then control the device. Obviously, it's a little bit more subtle than that. Typically, what happens is, just to give you a very basic working example of how these things occur, you can ask a participant, for example, to imagine moving their left hand or imagine moving their right hand, right? That's going to create a specific pattern of brain activity for each of the two options. The data is collected, pre-processed, and then you run a classifier or a decoder. This is typically done using a machine learning algorithm that has been pre-trained before, and then you have a model that is then able in real time to classify. And that's going to provide an output. In this case, it could be, for instance, to move a cursor on a screen right, either to the left or to the right, depending on what the classifier decoded in terms of the intention of the individual. Okay, so if the pattern that is recognized by the algorithm, the brain pattern, is a typical brain pattern of someone that is imagining moving their left hand, then the cursor would then move to the left if that's what the decoder identified. And conversely, if the pattern resembles a typical pattern of someone moving to the right, or imagining a movement of the right hand, that will be identified by the algorithm, and then the cursor will be slightly moved towards the right. So this also sounds very basic, but still the question is still open. How does this actually work? Why are we able, by just asking somebody to imagine moving the left hand or right hand, to create a setup where a cursor on screen is going to be moving left and right based on that? How does that work? So if we want to understand how that works, we need to take one step back and consider what happens in the brain when we're doing motor imagery. And first of all, before even talking about motor imagery, let's talk about movement. So what you see here in these figures is from a study published several years ago, where you see areas that are activated during an actual execution of movement. And as you can see, motor areas are active, but it's not only motor areas, it's a distributed network of areas. Now, interestingly, if you ask the participants or the individuals to imagine doing the same movements, what you see here in the upper line above here is pretty much the same areas light up again. In other words, when you're imagining a movement or when you're actually executing it, there are many areas that have overlapping activity. Obviously, it's not a 100% match because the actual execution areas are more present in the actual movement task, but there is a fair amount of overlap. In other words, what does this tell us? This tells us that there is a common brain areas and common activity that occurs whether you are actually executing a movement or imagining that movement. In other words, what you can do, if you can train an algorithm to identify real movements, left or right, for instance, or up and down, different directions, and then based on that, movement imagination, creating similar patterns, can also be classified and decoded. And this is super important because in many individuals who are unable to move, in the case, for example, of tetraplegic patients, they obviously still retain the ability to do mental imagery or motor imagery. Okay, so now that was just one example, and again, not all BMIs or BCIs work in that way, but that's just one example to show you how you can take mental activity, decode it and translate it, and allow a cursor, for instance, to be moving on a screen based on your brain activity and your own volition. Now, the next question when we're talking about brain-computer interfaces or brain-machine interfaces is, okay, what signals do we use? I mean, there are many brain signals that we can measure in different technologies. And I'm just going to talk about electrophysiological techniques here, but there are also other methods that you can be used, including fMRI or NIRS, for instance. But let's talk about electrophysiological brain signals that can be used in the context of BCI. So EEG is the one probably most of you are familiar with, electroencephalography, where we're measuring the electrical activity of the brain. Magnetosphereography, where we measure the magnetic fields generated by brain activity. ECOG or electrocorticography. These are grids that are placed underneath the skull, so directly on the surface of the brain. SEEG or stereotactic EEG, these are depth electrodes that are inserted in the brain. Now, these invasive recordings are only done in the context of patients that are candidates for surgery, and specifically in the case of epilepsy, drug-resistant epilepsy. There are also microelectrode recordings that allow for single and multi-unit recordings, and we will come back to that later. So in principle, we can see that there are two types of electrophysiological recordings that can be of interest for brain-computer interfaces. Either the data is non-invasive, and this is what you see here in green. These are EEG and MEG are two examples, or invasive recordings. And I apologize about talking about invasive recordings in a seminar or in a conference that is dedicated to non-invasive mathematics, but these are invasive recordings nonetheless. Basically, to keep in mind now, we have two types of recordings, electrophysiological. Either they involve surgery, so we will call them invasive, or they do not involve surgery, as in the case of EEG, MEG, and there will be non-invasive recordings. So let's look at some examples of invasive BMI technology. What you see here, I can ask you this quiz question, and I can help you by telling you that this distance down here is 2 millimeters. I'll give you a few seconds to think about this and what do you think this is. I presume most of you have guessed that what we're looking at here is an array of electrodes. This is the Utah array, a 10 by 10 array of electrodes that is packed into a very small surface area here, as you can see. So you can see here the Utah array. The interesting thing about this, that this was one of the very first prototypes of basically a proof of concept that we can record electrophysiological signals from populations of neurons in an individual, as you can see here, and that this activity can be decoded in real time and allow the individual to control a cursor on the screen. This was an important breakthrough, and it was published in Nature in 2006. There are many videos that were associated with this publication that you can check out, basically showing the ability of the patient here that was implanted with this micro electrode array to perform 2D cursor control. About 6 years later, 2012, there was again a publication by the same group in Nature, here showing an upgrade and progress with respect to that. In this case, the patient here implanted with this Utah array was able to control a robotic arm, as you can see here on these pictures, and of course you can find the video online to show how this works out. So again, these are very important proofs of concept. And so again, this was 2006, 2012, and I didn't mention, but even before that, before these dates, there were very seminal and foundational important work showing the feasibility of BCI and online decoding of intentions in animals. Groups such as Nicolet Lis's lab and others have published that even before. These publications here were the first to show that this was possible in humans. We're in 2021, and now, of course, there has been some progress in the field, and some of it is coming outside of academia from companies such as Elon Musk's company Neuralink, that many of you have heard about. And there's been a lot of buzz and hype about these new techniques and technology. And you can see here on the right, this was one example of the arrays that was developed by this company and implanted in rodents to show the ability to record activity of thousands of neurons in real time. There's also a publication that was associated with this about, I think, 2 years ago, very much like the list of authors on this bioarchives paper. It's Elon Musk and Neuralink. So you can check this out if you're interested. And there has been also an update on this about a year ago, where now the company has shown the ability to move from this device, which was behind the ear, as shown here with electrodes inside, to a system where the sensor is wireless and entirely invisible. So you could not tell from outside if the person has this sensor implanted in the brain or not. And this futuristic looking machine on the right here at the top of your screen, that's the robot that has been developed for the insertion, for the surgery, basically, of these sensors. And obviously these are showing humans, but this has been shown so far, has been done in animals. Demonstrations that were shown were done in pigs. So in the very latest version, just to give you a little bit more of information for this type of setup, you see here packed in this very small surface. It's basically 23 millimeters by 8 is the size of the implant. There are 1,024 channels. It works with the battery. It works all day. Needs to be recharged overnight. And the wireless range of the sensor is 5 to 10 meters, which is not bad. And again, one advantage is it's not externally visible. Of course, there's been a lot of noise and a lot of media and a lot of press that followed the announcements of Neuralink of these new sensors. And it seems to be also many of you are aware of the reluctance of many scientists and with regards to the technology and especially the claims made by this company. So Neuralink will tell you this is a WhatsApp discussion between the two. Neuralink will tell you it's a neurotech revolution. And many people, not everybody, of course, but many people from the scientific community were saying, well, we've done this already. We've seen this, we've done this in animals many years ago, and we even have proof of concept shown in humans. So there's nothing really new about this, and they were being grumpy about it. And Neuralink's response to that is to say, well, our system is wireless. It has over 1,000 channels, all streaming data for online processing. The implanted sensor now also measures temperature, pressure, and movement. And there's a super surgical robot that inserts the sensor. And so basically to that, the scientists are still answering many of them, blah, blah, blah. We did it first, so we published it, and there's nothing really new about this. And so this seems like a typical debate between scientists and engineers, if you will. On one hand, you have the scientists that made the discovery of the possibility of actually recording in real time the activity from the brain and using it, decoding the intentions and using it to control a device, versus engineers that are taking this, scaling it up to the next level in terms of technology, in terms of robustness, and in terms of stability of the signals, the possibility of making it fully wireless, and so on and so forth. So it seems at the end of the day that one could technically say that the scientists are just being jealous because the engineers managed to make an upgrade and a working system out of something that scientists have shown to be a possibility. I also found this, which is also a fun example where we're comparing here. Scientists would do this, engineer make it robust and make it here work. But I also found this for the liberal arts and the artists. And I'm not quite sure what the mathematicians' take on this would be, but that's a question open to you. So again, for talking again about the state of the art of what's been done in the context of brain-machine interfaces, it has been said that Neuralink's impressive technology is sort of wrapped up in Musk's typical hype, which again, as I said, one can give credit to the engineers for actually making systems that are really working and that are scaling up. So we will have to follow in the next years where this would lead to, and it might also provide new tools for scientists to work with. But at the same time, there have been claims overselling what the technology can currently do. Among other things, in some media, it has been Elon Musk has talked about, for example, uploading consciousness or memories to chips. And so this has also not done much service to the credibility of the technology and has opened also more questions and discussions. So that was just to update you a little bit on what's happening both in academia, and also in industry with regards to BMI and so on and so forth. Talking about some examples of non-invasive BMIs now, there are many possible applications. They range from using brain activity in the context of gaming, but also using EEG non-invasive to control a wheelchair, as you can see here, or in communication, or also to, again, to train your activity to generate specific brain patterns. And that, again, can be useful in the context of neurofeedback and for specific applications. Talking about neurofeedback, what is that? Basically, it's also a brain-computer interface setup where we are able in real time to measure and analyze brain activity, feed it back to the individuals, and try to have them learn to control that activity. Basically, exactly like biofeedback, but you're controlling the activity of the brain. Okay, so you can imagine many applications where that could be useful, in particular if you know the markers or biomarkers or neural markers of certain pathologies of the brain. You can consider this as an approach that could help individuals self-monitor or regulate that activity based on this neurofeedback. So one application among many is the use of neurofeedback in kids with attention deficits or disorders, for instance. And so, for example, just to explain how this would work, if you identify that there is a specific marker of brain activity, for instance, the power of oscillations in a specific frequency band and a specific area of the brain, if you think that is lower as it should be in a normal individual, in the case of a patient, it is lower, then what you would do is you would create a game where the individual learns to increase the activity of that specific brain area in those specific oscillations or that frequency band to control the device on the screen. And by doing that, that might then upregulate or increase the power that's for a specific frequency band for that brain area, and hopefully have the beneficial effects of reducing the symptoms, for instance. Again, there's neurofeedback has been has been around for a very long time. Some studies have shown very convincing results based on some very well-defined placebo and benchmarks effects, while others might not be that rigorous. So you need to be very careful if you go into the field of neurofeedback, because obviously it's also a market and people would like to market devices that do neurofeedback and sell them to everyone. Some of these are useful and some might not be that useful. Okay, a quick word about some invasive BMIs used in the search for new markers. This is old stuff we did many years ago. This is why probably the TV is this old. But we worked with Jean-Philippe Lachaud and colleagues back in Grenoble and Lyon on a system we called Brain TV. And this was basically set up where patients with implanted electrodes were looking at their activity online on a screen, and they were able to switch between the different channels of their brain and watch them and see if they could control the activity of these brain areas individually. And so this was used in the context of pre-surgical evaluation for epilepsy and functional mapping and BCI research. And so, as I said, the individuals could use a remote control even to switch between the different locations in their brain and look at the activity in real time and see if they can control this. We extended this with another setup called Brain Ball, where the individuals use their brain activity to try and control the positions of a ball on the screen, using different types of motor imagery, imagination, and cognitive tasks. I won't go into those details. Again, because we're talking about BCI, an important component and one that is completely on the other end of the spectrum compared to some of the invasive technologies that we've discussed so far, including the Neuralink approaches, where it's implanting chips or sensors in the brain. There's a whole part of the industry that's looking into creating and selling low-cost EEG headsets for brain-computer interfaces. And one of the sectors or parts of the industry that has a strong interest in this includes gaming, but also applications for meditation. And so moving from EEG grade lab grade headsets to the wireless, dry, and also low-cost EEG headsets is kind of tricky, obviously, because now there's a reason why these devices are much less expensive than a lab-grade EEG. And also there's a reason why most of the lab-grade EEG setups require gel for it to work properly, and also are not working with wireless setups. So what in the context of these low-cost EEG headsets, it has been claimed that they can be, for instance, used to measure concentration or quantify the extent of your relaxation. But the truth of the matter is that not all, but in many of the cases of these devices, there's quite a lot of noise, obviously. And the electrodes are not necessarily in the best location to detect the activity, and there aren't enough electrodes in many cases. These setups are also very sensitive to noise that comes from the muscles or from movements. And so in other words, they're very sensitive to artifacts. And probably more collaboration between neuroscientists and the industry generating these headsets, including also the video game industry and others, needs to happen and needs to occur for these setups to be actually more sensitive to actual brain activity and less sensitive to noise. Yeah, this is another example where these headsets, and as you can see, the location of the electrodes here, typically you have electrodes in the front here, so we'll be recording activity. And you can understand why some of these setups, again, although they have showed some amount of success, they can also be very liable to artifacts and movements and muscle artifacts. This is another setup from the Emotive. Again, you can see it here, and I'm not quite sure why these people are half naked and why they don't look very happy. Here's another example where people look a little bit happier. Again, they're all wearing all sorts of funky low-cost EEG devices. In some cases, it seems like it's quite magical, because in the upper right corner here, it even looks like the electrodes are not even connected to or they're not even touching the head. So that's quite an achievement if that works. I'd also like to tell you some current research trends that are related to BCI, to the BCI field. So again, when we're talking about BCI, as we said, the fundamental aspect is that you're recording brain activity, and in real time, you're trying to classify the content of those signals to use them for communication with an external device. And so when we're talking about classification, we're talking about the use of algorithms that learn from the data, that are calibrated and that are able to generalize to new instances, and ideally in real time or online. So the use of these algorithms is super useful for the brain decoding field. And we talk a lot about brain decoding models and brain encoding models in this context. And it turns out that beyond the very specific BCI application, so the real-time application in a closed loop setup, these algorithms are also super useful just as a tool for neuroscience research. In other words, the ability to learn from the data and decode brain states, for instance, or brain intentions. Of course, that is useful in the context of a brain-computer interface, but that is also very important in the case of neuroscience research, because it can help you address important questions. So typically what you can do, you record brain activity, and based on that, you can use those signals in using machine learning, and you can actually try to do a data mining approach on this data. And that can be very useful, as I said, for questions in cognitive neuroscience or systems neuroscience, but also you can imagine very many applications in the context of clinical neuroscience. And to give you just some examples, this is a not so up-to-date picture of the people in my lab. or collaborators with my lab, the COCO lab, the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience lab. And in many of the projects that are led in the lab, we use MEG EEG or intracranial EEG, apply advanced signal processing tools on it, and then run them through machine learning or classifiers to do many things. We can decode, or we can classify or predict, for example, decision-making tasks where the individuals are making a free decision on whether they want to move towards the right or the left, or whether they want to choose one object over another. We can also look at the ability to decode motor intentions. Again, this has an interest for BCI, but it also has a basic neuroscience research interest. That you can use these algorithms to try and predict the intentions of an individual. And by doing that, you're going to learn about the neural correlates of those intentions. We have projects that have been looking at meditative states, also in collaboration with Chieti, Laura Marzetti's group. We also have projects where we're looking at sleep stages, where we try to decode using these classifiers the different sleep stages. And this is a tedious task, and it could be very helpful to have that done automatically or semi-automatically. We have also an interesting project ongoing where a PhD student in my lab is training algorithms to try and differentiate brain activity of individuals that recall or remember their dreams compared to those that do not remember their dreams. So we have high and low dream recallers. And by using these algorithms, applying them to the brain data of these individuals during their sleep, we are able to identify brain properties that distinguish the two groups. And by doing that, we learn more about the neural substrates of dream, or more specifically, dream recall. You can also use these algorithms to do person authentication, so you can identify individuals. This becomes something like fingerprinting. There's a project that we've been working on for several years in our lab now using EEG to do exactly that. And last but not least, we can look at brain disorders such as autism, schizophrenia, depression, epilepsy, and Parkinson's. So I'd like to switch gears now and move towards talking about the use of BCI as a new tool also for creative artwork. As I said, you can connect your brain to a device. You can do that in different contexts, and you can also explore ways that could help you be more creative and explore creative artworks using that. And I can just tell you about one of these systems that I'm showing up here. This one's called, I think, the Endless Loop. Here on the bottom, the Endless Loop March. And it's a project that was developed by artists and neuroscientists in China. And what happens here is that you have an individual that has an EEG headset. He's watching something on a screen, and then that information on the screen, that visual information on the screen, obviously those stimuli will affect the activity of the brain. Then that activity of the brain is going to be connected to the screen of a second individual and change the content of what that individual is seeing. That in turn will have an impact on the neural signals of that second individual. That activity then is fed back into the screen of the first individual. In other words, there's a loop between these two individuals through their perception of what they were looking at simultaneously. This is another one that I'm quite like. This is Masaki Bato from Kyoto in Japan, and he developed this brain pulse music machine that is also connecting his brain activity to this funky looking device to create sound and noise and potentially music. And he enjoys doing this, I think, with his wife. And this seems like a lot of fun, even though they're not smiling much, but I'm sure this is a lot of fun too. There's also a lot of aesthetic explorations of brain signals using real-time processing and brain-computer interfaces. There are really a lot of projects. So if you're a student in the field and you'd like to explore these things, I highly recommend exploring the interactions between art and science using brain-computer interfaces. We've done this also in our lab. But here I'm showing you some other examples. There's the Brainarium project by Romain Grandchamp, the Collectif Télémire in Lyon a couple of years ago. And here there's also an example of work, an installation, mind processing by Sam. This was work presented, I think, through NeuroHack at La Payas in Paris. So, what's the future going to look like? What are the potential utilities of some of these techniques and some of the brain-computer interfaces that I've discussed with you today? Generally, in the future, we want to improve stuff. So let's see what we could improve with these technologies. From a clinical perspective, first of all, we'd like to improve the quality of life for patients with motor impairments, like tetraplegics, for example, by enabling them to control a cursor or a wheelchair or a neuroprosthesis through their brain activity. And as you saw, although for the moment this seems to be more efficient using implanted sensors, it is also to some extent doable, and there have been a lot of proofs of concept showing that this is also to some extent possible using non-invasive recordings, although the techniques need to be still refined and improved. Secondly, BCI technology can allow to restore communication with locked-in syndrome patients. I don't know if Marco Congedo is going to talk about the P300 speller in his presentation later on, but the P300 speller is one way where that allows individuals to that don't have the ability anymore to communicate, like the locked-in syndrome patients, to identify letters on a screen that they are interested in using in spelling, like a spelling machine. And that's based on attentional mechanisms, specifically the P300 wave. We also like to use such techniques to improve clinical diagnosis. And this can be done in many cases, but one example would be the altered state of consciousness, and specifically the ability to distinguish between vegetative states and the locked-in syndrome. In other words, detect the presence of consciousness in individuals that cannot express that they are conscious. That could be also a useful application. I talked briefly before about brain training using neurofeedback. One application is ADHD, but there is a lot of interest also in using neurofeedback for other applications such as anxiety or depression. And there are, as I said, many applications out there. Some of them show a lot of potentials, and others you need to be careful about because not always quite clear what these techniques are based on. And again, the field is still an emerging field, I would say. And then neurohabilitation using brain-machine interfaces. This is also another application where we can accelerate and guide functional recovery in patients, for example, with stroke. Now, if we're not talking about clinical applications, it seems that, again, with the availability of these techniques and the ability to control with your mind all sorts of devices, your computer, your Facebook account, your robotic arm to give you coffee, as you see here, there's a lot of talk about the ability, whether we want to go more and more towards augmented capacities. But the question to be asked here is, what is really an improvement of our quality of life? What and who defines it? And do we need these type of approaches to improve our lives? And this leads to the follow-up question, which is more of an ethical consideration, which is related to, are there any risks that are associated with brain-computer interface technologies and the ability to communicate between brains and machines? Is it a good idea to try and thrive towards the ability of mind reading through machines? What about the collected data? So assume we are able to collect a lot of data from individuals on a daily basis. Who has access to that data? What about the privacy of that information? Same thing also with real-time brain stimulation, which is also a useful approach that can be combined with in the context of a brain-computer interface. So be able to record at the same time and provide stimulations based on the recordings. That can have a lot of very useful applications, but it might also open the opportunity for DIY types of do-it-yourself approaches where people will self-stimulate themselves with some of these setups and potentially ending up harming themselves. And also, last but not least, again, as I mentioned before, thriving towards augmented capacities and cognition, enhanced cognition or enhanced capacities through these brain-computer interfaces. Is this something that we would like our societies to go towards or not? That's an open question, and it's a debate to be had with the whole of society, not just in academia or in the private sector. So now, I still have a few more minutes. If we compare brain-computer interfaces to what I'm calling here a muscle-machine interface, I think there are some similarities. There's the concept of rehabilitation or recovery in both. The concept of training, you can train your brain, you can train your muscles. There's the concept of entertainment. It's fun and enjoyable to work out as it is to use your brain. And so again, we're talking about the extremes. So if we do an extreme workout of our muscles or of the brain, this opens the question again of where do we want to go? Do we want to go towards cyborgs and anything that looks like this? What is too much? What is the direction we want to go in? And probably the answer to that is, it's not about what is possible and what is not possible. It's really to ask the question of what is useful, what are the ethical implementations, and how to provide some guidelines, both for our society and for researchers, scientists, and engineers in this field. So to conclude, some general comments I'd like to share before taking questions. So there are a lot of challenges and open questions, as you might have guessed from the overview that I've provided you with today. The basic neurophysiology, in other words, the correlates of many of the tasks that we seek to decode to use in the context of BCI are still not 100% elucidated. And as you might recall, what I said in the beginning is, if you want to work on decoding, sorry, you need to have some idea about the neural correlates or the encoding processes, or where to start looking in your brain data, or what type of signal you should be using for this type of research. And so we need domain expertise, and we need a better grip on the cognitive processes that we seek to classify. There's a lot of work to be done on the methods side of things, in terms of the classification algorithms, decoding, and also the ability to work with handcrafted features, or not to work with handcrafted features and use approaches such as artificial neural networks or deep learning that can work more robustly with raw data and do representational learning associated with that. So there are many open questions still in terms of what are the most efficient methods to be used in terms of classification for brain-computer interfaces. And again, going beyond proofs of concept, that is still something that it's taken quite some time, more than 20 or 30 years that these techniques have been tested, and people are working on these techniques. But for many of these approaches, we still seem to be stuck at the level of proofs of concept. And potentially maybe the interest that is coming also in from the industry and from companies such as Neuralink will accelerate this and help scale up to a more industrial level applications. There's also need for better integration of intelligent user interfaces into BCI systems. And in terms of clinical applications, again, I mentioned before restoring mobility, communication, neural rehabilitations, and there are also some interesting applications potentially for mood disorders, such as depression, for instance. I think neurofeedback training is also an exciting application, and as I said, it needs to be done with a lot of care, because we need to, as in many interventions, it is really important to have nice controls, conditions, and placebo to compare to. There is still a very strong interest in using BCI from the side of video games and serious games, so that's interesting. And there's a lot of opportunities to explore art and creativity and art and science applications using BCI. I mentioned the important ethical considerations, and I think they are really important, and they need to be taken into account when asking questions about the type of research that we will want to conduct and applications that we want to build based on these techniques. And also, I mentioned this, this friendly or not so friendly debate between engineers and scientists when it comes to BCI and BCI development. And I think the bottom line of all of this is that we just need to work together, and providing better tools and more robust tools at the end of the day is something that is going to be also super important also for the progress in the scientific domain. And of course, mathematicians too, I did not mention it, but obviously. So I'd like to finish by acknowledging sources of funding that support our work over the past years. I'd also like to briefly mention this new center that we created here in Montreal, in Canada and Quebec, 2 years ago, called the UNIQ Center, UNIQ for Unifying AI and Neuroscience in Quebec. We have a website, unique.quebec, and there's a Twitter handle there that you can check out. And basically, the objective of this center is to bring together scientists from the AI field, from artificial intelligence, and scientists from neuroscience, and have them work together by co-supervising students and by creating meetings and events such as the main conference, Montreal AI and Neuroscience, and others. So feel free to reach out or to check out some of these resources if you're interested in the interface between artificial intelligence and neuroscience. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I tried to leave some time for questions, so I hope I still have a little bit of time. Grazie mille, it's been a pleasure. And again, I would have loved to be in Rome with you, but it will be next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thanks a lot. Beautiful, beautiful overview. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall I stop?
Let me see if there are questions. Well, maybe. No, I also have a question, which is, so would you say that the current limitations of BCI systems are more due to like the hardware, so what we are measuring, which is kind of not enough to do much more than we are doing now, or is it mostly that we need to develop more software and of course training? So there's a lot of training, this is clear, but is it do you think that it's mostly software that we need, or is it hardware, like we need more data or different kind of data to improve?
So yeah, this is a very good question, and clearly in the BCI setup you have the hardware component where you're actually measuring those signals and your ability to measure signals from the brain, which is going to be a very important question, because if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. If you're measuring poor signals, noisy signals, it's going to be really difficult to get anything out of it. So that's the basis. So I would say that has to be improved, and there's no limitations, I think, to what's good enough. The more the better in terms of precision. So I think that there's no question about the fact that we need better tools and better techniques in terms of measurements, right? But at the same time, from an algorithmic perspective and from a machine learning algorithm and the ability to train algorithms, there's now with the increase of on all the excitement about using AI and using artificial neural nets, there is a window of opportunity to bring in, to be very innovative in terms of tools. And even while we're waiting for the quality of the signals that we can have to improve and become more stable, there are ways, let's say, with software tricks and software algorithms to just be able to get as much as we can out of the signals we currently have. So I think the simple answer to your question, and I guess you were expecting this answer, is yes, we need both, of course. We need to improve on both sides.
But still there is room for improvement given the current state of technology, let's say, the current state of hardware.
Yes, absolutely. And as I said, so for example, all the debate about Neuralink, I find quite exciting and quite interesting, frankly, because again, even though you have many people from the field of neuroscience that say, well, this is not so new, this has been done in 2006 or 2012, or it has been done in monkeys even before that, and so on. What is new is that because now this is not just a proof of concept, it's actually building a system that is more robust, that works wireless, that provides 1,000 channels, not just 100 channels. In other words, it's scaling up and turning into a device that then in turn can go back into the labs, assuming the price is going to be affordable, and it's going to, I think, boost BCI research in that respect. Mm-hmm. But you will still need the expertise of computer scientists, of mathematicians, but also of cognitive neuroscientists to design the task and identify what type of cognitive tasks do you need. How can you combine that with other things like stimulation? I see Paulo's here, and I know Paulo's also working on like detecting and stimulating at the same time. So I think there are a lot of things that these expertise need to come together. That's why I think this is not a field that it's, of course, the fact that companies such as Neuralink from Elon Musk are going into this, it's generating a lot of excitement, and there's the stock market is getting interested in things like that, so it's bringing in money. So maybe it's a good thing that there is this excitement so that actual robust devices will come out of it. But you will still need the knowledge of the neuroscientists, the computer scientists, the mathematicians, and everybody else to actually make that really become useful.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. We have Paulo wanted to ask a question. Paulo, you should be able to. Oh, excellent.
Thank you. Karim, I know it's kind of a philosophical question, but I would like to ask you, how would you define, given that we have overcome the technical difficulties of stimulating the brain in real time, how would you define an instantaneous brain state? Because with our classical approach to EEG and MEG datasets, we are generally talking about connectivity states, which are actually pseudo statistics over 100 trials. And so on one hand, it's sure there are some instantaneous brain states. On the other hand, the alphabet we have right now to describe them is rather poor.
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, thanks for your question. It seems to me that so you're alluding to the fact that when we look at data over multiple trials, specifically if we want to measure something like coherence where you would need many trials, you have an idea of what's going on. But then if you go to the single trial, you don't necessarily see that pattern anymore because it emerges from multiple repetitions.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I think in the case of BCI research or any type of online application like neurostimulation or others, we don't have the choice but to work with single trials. So I think we need to develop, maybe as you were saying, an alphabet or a dictionary of like single trial activities. And maybe in some cases you see the same effect as on the over many trials, but it's just weaker, noisier, and by having many trials it clears up. But for some other types of brain signatures, it might not be the case that, for example, you can have just changes and you have a burst of activity, let's say of alpha power, that occurs at different times across different trials. But when you average that out, it gives you a sustained, nice alpha power activity, right? It doesn't mean that it's sustained in all the trials. It just happens at different moments. And in the context of BCI or real-time analysis, you need to focus on the single trial. So I think we need to acquire the data in the setting that we want to use for the BCI. And And I like the question of instantaneous brain states. I think it's going to depend on the task. What is the time frame of what's happening?
But basically the analysis approach has to change.
Yes, and what we can do, I mean, there are ways of looking. So you mentioned a tricky one, which is connectivity. There are tools to look at connectivity in single trials on short time windows. We should work with those rather than with measures, obviously, that require multiple repetitions. Or so, for example, even phase locking value, I think there's a 2000 paper by Jean-Philippe Lachaud and others, where it's a single trial. Yeah, it's single trial PLV.
Okay.
It's a paper in 2000, and it's basically looking at PLV in single trials over like a short window, and so that would be potentially more useful for if we think connectivity is useful in real time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question, because you mentioned many times ethical issues, and but I'm not sure if you talked about them specifically. And well, of course, BCIs as tools, they raise ethical questions, but what are like the specific questions that are specific of BCIs? I can think maybe of privacy issues, because you're kind of reading the mind, so there's no privacy there.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of them. One of them is going to be, as I said, data accessibility and privacy. So if an insurance company has access to your mobile, to your brain activity, because you're using, I don't know, you're using a meditation application that uses brain signals connected to your phone, but that information is somehow available on the cloud, and an insurance company has access to that, they might change your insurance policy based on any risks that they decide that you might have based on your brain data. I mean, that's a silly but potentially real example of we need, when we start using these neurotechnology devices, we need to know who has access to that data and what's being done with it. So that is one example. And then the other more ethical, more maybe philosophical question is more related to the idea, for example, of augmented capacities, where individuals want to be able, maybe you have two arms, but you want to be able to use your EEG to control a robotic third arm. I don't know why you would want to do that. I wouldn't. But it opens question of also, at some point, maybe if we think 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line where the research is going to be, what is the definition of your own body? Is it you and your devices and all your robotics arms? And also, what is the liability? So if I provide somebody with a device that allows that person to stimulate their brain because they have an exam, instead of, you're actually using a setup that injects electrical or magnetic activity. Providing such devices, is it going to get people hooked on it if they manage to find a way of using it so that it stimulates their dopamine release and all of a sudden they're addicted to these devices? I'm just imagining some end of the world scenarios, but I mean, you see where we can go with this. Well, I mean, we don't know exactly the limits, and it needs to be sort of, we need to think about these things in advance. So.
Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
Looks like the timing is like we're 4 minutes behind schedule already. Is that correct?
Yeah, but but we started 5 minutes later, so yeah, that's fine. Okay, so thank you again, Karim, very much. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, looking forward to some of the other talks and to discussing with you guys more.
Thank you. So we will have a 10 minutes break and start again at 45 with Marco, who's already here. So ciao Marco. Hi.
Ciao, come stai?
Bene, grazie.
Senti, possiamo fare una prova?
Sì.
Che faccio?
Perfetto. Se vuoi condividere le slide, giusto per vedere che funzioni.
Vediamo se funziona. Va.
Sì.
Ce l'hai?
Wonderful. Perfetto.
Right. Okay, then see you in 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you.